Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest research news. War atrocities are often said to have been committed by so-called normal people, individuals who, had they not been explicitly ordered to do so, would have never committed such horrendous acts. But why is it that simply being ordered to do something makes people much more willing to commit horrendous acts? To discuss the impact that an order has on the human brain, today we are joined by Dr. Emily Kaspar. Dr. Emily Kaspar is a social and cognitive neuroscientist from the University Libre of Brussels. She's one of the leading authors of a new study entitled Obeying Orders Reduces Vicarious Brain Activation Towards Victims' Pain. Emily, thank you very much for joining us today. So why is it that people are more willing or more capable to carry out horrendous acts when they're ordered to do so?
Yes, thank you for inviting me. So it's true that when you look at history in general, the history of nations reports several acts of obedience, and it seems that people are able to commit really atrocious acts towards others when they accept to comply with the orders received from an authority. And we were wondering, why is it the case? Why simply obeying orders would influence so much moral behaviors? And one of the critical mechanisms that can explain prosocial or antisocial behaviors are what we call empathy. So empathy, from the brain perspectives, is the fact that when you observe someone in pain, it activates brain regions that are also activated when you experience the same pain. This is why you are able to understand and feel what other feels, because your brain processes their pain as if it was yours. And this empathic reaction is what prevents you to cause pain to someone else, because you would be able to understand that pain. And here in that experiment, we were wondering to what extent obeying orders would influence how the brain processes the pain of others.
I see. So can you tell us a little bit about how you carried out your research?
Yes. So if you think about how to study obedience and how obedience modifies behavior, of course, many people will obviously think about the experiments conducted by Stanley Milgram in the 60s.
Yet actually, 50% of the subjects obeyed the experimenter's commands fully in the experiment depicted in this film.
165 volts. Time. That guy's hollering in there. Continue, please.
The problem with those experiments is that they are not replicable anymore, mostly due to strong ethical concerns about the task. And so what we did is that we developed another approach to study this question. So basically, we invited volunteers by pairs. So one was assigned to be the agent and the other one was assigned to be the victim. The agent was placed in the MRI scanner to record his or her brain activity, and the victim was located in another room. And so basically, the agent in the scanner was either free to decide which action to execute or received orders from me. And those actions were either sending a painful electric shock to the victim, but earning 5 cents each time. So it's a very small amount of money, and this is a real pain. Or not sending the shot, but not earning money. So it places participants in moral situations, because they have to decide between sending a real shock to someone for a small monetary gain or not. Of course, that pain is calibrated on one's own pain threshold. So of course, it's not like in the Stanley Milgram's experiments, in which participants believed that they were inflicting potentially deadly pain to someone else. Here, they know it's calibrated, but still it's painful, and it's just 5 cents. And so basically, agents were totally free to decide, either totally free to decide to administer that shock or not, or received orders from me to deliver that shock or not. And they could witness that shock through a webcam that displayed the hand of the victim receiving the shocks at the same time or not.
So going back to your first question, You were saying that is really the empathy part of the brain that is what controls us from inflicting pain and understanding that something that we are going to do will cause a lot of pain for on the recipient.
Yes, so that was the main mechanism that we were targeting. That's why we used the procedure with the electric shocks, because when your hand receives an electric shock, it produces a visible muscular twitch. And so it means that the one witnessing that pain can really process that pain in his own or her own brain. And that's how we measure empathy. So we measure the reaction of the brain of the person in the role of the agent when that person witnesses that electric shock being delivered. And we compared that reaction either when they were free to decide to administer that pain or where they were receiving orders to administer that pain. So in both cases, they were the authors of the action because they were the ones pressing the shock button. But in one case, they were free to do it, and in the other one, they received the instructions to do it.
So since each participant was first in a either coerced situation or free, both of them, you're saying that it was up to them to inflict the pain, but in one case it was just whenever they wanted to do it, if I understood correctly, and otherwise you would tell them. So what are some of the differences in the responses and feedback that you collected from the participant, depending on whether they were coerced to do so or they freely did so?
So, but first of all, we observed that indeed they administered more shocks when they were coerced to do so than when they could freely decide, which makes sense somehow. But beyond what we observed in the brain, participants also reported that they felt less responsible when they were following orders. They felt less sorry for the victims for administering pain to them in the coercive condition. They also felt less bad to administer the shocks to the victim. And so these are the subjective experience during the task. So when they were obeying orders, they felt less responsible, less sorry, and less bad, while they were still the author of the action, compared to being free to choose that. So that's for their subjective experience about how they felt during the task.
Yes, and so I read, and as you just mentioned, the second point was that they felt that they were inflicting less pain, even though they clearly knew that it was the exact same amount of pain that was being inflicted, whether they were coerced or whether they did so freely.
Yeah, exactly. And this one, we didn't expect that result at all. So participants were explicitly said that the pain threshold would never vary for the victim. That would be exactly the same during the entire experiment. And from time to time, we were recording during the task how painful they felt the pain was for the victim in both experimental conditions. And indeed, they reported that it was less painful for the victim in the coercive condition compared to the free condition, while they knew it was exactly the same pain. So that was interesting because the reduced activity that we observed in brain regions associated with the processing of pain in the brain of agents was attenuated when they were obeying orders, but also their subjective report, despite they know explicitly that it was exactly the same pain.
I see. Wow. Yeah, that is very interesting and scary. And so the participants each really did three things, right? One, they were coerced to inflict the pain. Once they did it freely, but then they were also the victim. And
Yeah.
everybody did both of these jobs. So did it make a difference whether they were victim first or not in how much pain they inflicted and what they thought about what they were doing?
In fact, not. So the main results were not affected by the order of the roles that they had. But we observed a small tendency, it's not the first time that we observed it, that those who were victim first tend to administer a bit more shocks when they turn agent. We don't know if this is a sort of vindictiveness or perception of fairness, in the sense that they may say, okay, I have received what I think like 12 shocks, so perhaps I would administer more the same. So we don't know exactly what guided this kind of behavior, and it's not the first time that we observed that. But the main results were not, so the perception of pain, the brain reaction for the pain was exactly the same, no matter if participants were victims first or agents first.
So to summarize your study, which you've done so nicely, but just to make sure I got it, I got the main points. That is that through the monitoring of brain activity as well as some information that you collected from respondents, you found that when someone is ordered to do something, it affects the part of their brain that has to do with empathy. And therefore,
Mhm.
when they're ordered to inflict pain, they feel that they're less responsible for it, they feel less guilty about it, and thirdly, they believe that they're inflicting less pain than had they not been coerced to do so, and therefore the combination of all these things make it much easier for people to commit horrendous acts when they're coerced to do so.
Yes, that's totally correct. And we also found that brain regions associated with the feeling of guilt, the activity in those brain regions was reduced in the coercive condition compared to when they could freely decide. So it's really a mix of feeling less responsible, feeling less empathy, feeling less guilty. It's a combination of a lot of process that apparently are impacted when people obey orders, and altogether it can easily explain why people are able indeed to commit atrocious acts under coercion.
Okay, and I also read something small in your paper. I mean, this wasn't really part of your main findings or anything, but in your methodology section, you put that you had to dismiss three of the participants because they weren't following the orders whatsoever. I mean, one of them apparently just kept on inflicting pain without being asked. So, is there anything to take from this, or was just that, sometimes abnormal things happen when you're doing research?
So, to be honest, when I developed that paradigm, it was not in that study. I thought that everyone would disobey my orders. I thought that really never, ever would administer a real painful shock to someone else for 5 cents. And that study combined with all my previous studies, I've tested about like 1,000 people so far. And with that specific method, my rate of disobedience is drastically low, which is a bit worrying, in fact. I think I have about 18 participants out of 1,000 who actually refused to administer shocks to the other person. And you're right that sometimes I have the opposite, sometimes, but it's not frequent. I have people, even when I say do not administer a shock, they still administer it. That's what I call antisocial disobedience. And that's very tricky. And in fact, it's part of the research I'm conducting so far, because now I'm trying to understand why there are so few people that are able to resist immoral orders. From different genocides through the history of mankind, those people has been called righteous among the nations. And I'm trying to understand why there are so few. Why is it easier for people to follow orders, even if those orders are cruel, than saying no? And now I'm trying, since in the study that you have just described, my rate of disobedience is drastically low. I'm currently trying to develop paradigms in which people would be a bit more willing to disobey, in order for me to understand what distinguishes people who can resist immoral orders from those who cannot. And I'm conducting this research in different countries, such as Rwanda, for instance, where genocides took place.
Okay, wow, that's very interesting. And so, finally, Emily, what would you say is the main contribution of your research to the literature?
Yeah, so the literature about empathy and its relationship to prosocial behavior is quite known in neuroscience. But here the main point is that, with the experiments of Stanley Milgram, no one really dared to approach those questions of obedience because of all the ethical concerns it raised. And so I would say that if I have to, if it brings something to the literature, it's definitively to understand better why obeying orders has such influence on moral behaviors. It's not about the link between empathy, guilt, and behavior per se, but really why obedience influence behavior. Because from the Milgram studies, only situational factors has been described as influencing obedience, but the mechanism per se that explain such modification of behavior were not addressed. And this is one of the first studies that really tried to understand why is it the case that behaviors are impacted by coercion.
And so actually I had one last question.
Sure.
And just off camera right now, you were telling me that you have another study coming out soon, which will be available by the time this video is uploaded. Can you just give us a quick preview of the main findings and what your next study is about?
Yeah. So in fact, in that incoming studies, we were interested in the military population because the military works in a highly hierarchical and sometimes coercive structures. And we wanted to understand how these structures impact several cognitive functions associated with prosocial behavior. And basically, we found that working in a military structure or highly hierarchical environment has a very negative influence on the sense of agency. So the sense of agency is another mechanism, which is the fact that you know that you are the author of an action. That's something that we all have as healthy adults. And that feeling is strongly impacted when you work in the military on a daily basis. But we also observe that it depends on the military rank you have. So that negative effect of the military environment on the sense of agency is not present for officers. And officers are more trained in a way that they know that they are responsible and accountable for their actions, but also for the actions of their troops. And so it sounds like it is perhaps possible to train people to feel more responsible for the outcomes of their actions, since we observe that military officers have more sense of agency than privates or junior cadets, for instance, despite the military environment. So it opens new perspective to perhaps train people to understand better and to not to have these detrimental effects on human cognition when they obey orders.
I see. And so what kind of methodology did you use? Did you use similar experiment and style of?
Yeah, the methodology was the same. It was not the same mechanisms that were targeted, but the methodology with the shocks and free versus coerced was used in that study.
Okay, all right. Well, sounds super interesting. Looking forward to reading that one as well. So thank you very much for joining us, Emily, and thank you very much for joining us at the latest research news.
Thank you very much for inviting me.